Okay, everyone. Well, I'd like to thank you for coming this evening, and I definitely would like to thank Sarah Wassberg Johnson. She's our food historian for this evening's program. I'm Linda from the Upper Saddle River Library. In this virtual program, we are going to be talking about when the groom had his own cake, the American wedding food traditions. And Sarah, she's our food historian here. She's a frequent blogger. If you look in the group chat, she put up where her blog is. I've told her I've stalked her a little bit before this program, so that's why we have her coming in today. And let's see, I got everybody in. And with that, I'm going to now mute myself as well and let Sarah take it over. Oh, one last thing. I will monitor the chat for anybody that has questions going through the program. And at the end, Sarah will look at the chat and I'll make sure as well that the chat is up and going and that your questions do get answered. So I am now going to let Sarah take it away.
Thank you so much. Just bear with me a minute here, everybody, as I share my screen. Oh, and start my slideshow from the beginning. All right, so tonight's talk is all about wedding food traditions. Like Linda said, it's the perfect time of year to be talking about all this because, of course, June is the traditional time for weddings in the United States and other places around the world too. So again, my name is Sarah Wassberg Johnson, also known as the food historian. The title of tonight's talk is When the Groom Had His Own Cake, Food and Wedding Traditions in America, 1850 to today. So we're going to be covering a lot of historical ground. We're going to be talking first about kind of wedding traditions more generally and food traditions around wedding traditions throughout the decades and different eras in American history. And then at the end, we're going to do like a timeline of wedding cake styles. So just bear that in mind as we go through. So for some context, let's talk a little bit about weddings before 1850, right? So most of the wedding ceremonies before 1850 happened in the home or in the minister's home, right? You might occasionally have some church weddings as well, but in the United States, a lot of them were hosted in the home. The minister would come to your home, or you would go to the parsonage, right, wherever it was to get married. They were pretty informal. Attendance was usually family only, right? And then you would have a wedding breakfast afterwards. And it's called a wedding breakfast primarily because you would get married historically in medieval morning mass, right? So you'd go to morning mass and you get married as part of morning mass in the medieval time period. Most weddings in this time period were also occurring in the morning, particularly if they were in church. And then having a wedding breakfast immediately after the service was pretty much the norm by the early 19th century. It was usually fairly low key, fairly small, depending on the family and their level of wealth. Sometimes there was not any food. Sometimes there's just cake and punch. That's kind of a tradition that continues until the 20th century. And most of the people in the home did all the cooking. Now, obviously, if you're fabulously wealthy, no matter what the time period, you're going to be having much more extravagant versions of all of this. But for most ordinary people, this is how it worked. In the 1840s through 60s, we have some big changes in our wedding culture, largely influenced by Queen Victoria's 1841 wedding. She wore a white wedding dress and had orange blossoms in her hair and her bouquet. And that kind of set the trend for the next 150 years, right? Prior to that, people wore their best clothes, not necessarily a special outfit for the wedding, particularly women. They would just wear their best clothes. If they did have a dress made for the wedding, then that would become like their best dress once they got married. And again, wedding receptions are still mostly in the home, and the focus is on the families of the bride and groom. In the latter Victorian period into the Gilded Age, we start to get some more public facing weddings. Weddings tend to be more and more held in churches. Receptions tend to be larger. Sometimes they are still in the home. And this becomes kind of a thing that is like almost a status symbol, that you can have a wedding in your home, that it's big enough to have a wedding reception in the home. But they start to move into, halls and restaurants and hotels and places like that. And then of course, the Gilded Age, we have all these fabulously wealthy people, and they are throwing incredibly lavish wedding receptions. You also start to get the rise of society pages in the local newspaper. Most newspapers up until, the Civil War were not more than 4 pages long, including things like the New York Times. But as we get into the latter part of the 19th century, people go kind of periodical and newspaper mad. They start subscribing to dozens sometimes of these newspapers and periodicals, and they just keep getting longer and longer. And one of the things they start to include is the gossip columns, right? So anyone who was anyone in your local town or city, if they got married, if they got engaged, it would be announced in the society pages. The wedding would be described in the society pages, not only who was in attendance, but what they were wearing and what the flowers were like and what the wedding breakfast was like. That would all be described. The First World War, we've got some changes in what's available. We're only in the war in the United States for 2 years, technically, April of 1917 till November of 1918. And we had some rationing going on. It was largely voluntary for individuals, although there were some mandates for businesses. It mostly affected the middle and upper class because they were the most committed to this voluntary rationing. We start to get war brides, like this lovely young lady here in her, late 1910s, borderline 1920s looking outfit, and her groom in his military uniform. And I love to share this. If you follow my World War Wednesday on the blog, you maybe seen this before. This is a great cartoon from 1917. And it says, "Hooray, I've gotten permission from the food controller to throw," oh, sorry, the screen sharing is covering. I think it says to throw 4 grains of rice or something like that. So it's a very World War I era joke that the food controller, who is Herbert Hoover, the administrator for the United States Food Administration, he had to get permission to waste food by throwing rice at the bride and groom. So, but you can see also this illustration, she's got 3 bridesmaids, they're in matching outfits, everybody's got giant bouquets, there's all these flower decorations. Here's the organ, the church organ hiding in the back, right? They're getting married in a church. So all of these hallmarks of weddings are starting to become more and more standard. In the 1920s, again, more of our receptions are moving outside of the home, and we start to get dancing at our receptions. That was not necessarily a thing in the late 19th, early 20th century. Prohibition really puts a damper on champagne toasts and punch and things like that. So Emily Post in 1922 writes about Prohibition and Champagne. She says, "There always used to be champagne. A substitute is at best a poor thing, and what the prevailing one is to be is as yet not determined. Orange juice and ginger ale, or white grape juice and ginger ale with sugar and mint leaves, are 2 attempts at a satisfying cup that have been offered lately." So here people are struggling to figure out what to replace champagne with at weddings for champagne toasts and things like that. The Great Depression doesn't seem to have a huge effect on wedding receptions, likely because people would save up for them. And also the Great Depression affected different economic strata in different parts of the country differently, right? Not in the same way. Not everyone was as severely impacted by the Great Depression as some people were. So Prohibition is repealed in 1933. That's like a big hurrah for booze returning to wedding receptions. And you can kind of see from this great photo I found, unidentified bride. She's cutting her cake in 1935. So we've got the frosted white cake with the topper, right? There's flowers everywhere. Everybody's all dressed up, and she's got some matching bridesmaids here with her very elaborate, almost 19th century looking dress, right? Not quite the same as our 1920s look. Here's another one. This is one me maybe saw if you saw my email. This is a bride and groom being pelted with rice in 1935. Again, he's got you know, his spats and his morning coattails, and she's got a satin dress on, and there's people very dramatically throwing giant handfuls of rice at them, which we'll get into why they do that. World War II, we have the return of war brides. This is one of my favorites, is cardboard wedding cakes, right? Because of course we have rationing. So sugar is rationed, butter is rationed, fat is rationed in general. So I found this great image. It's a magazine cover for Woman in Home. And so she's a war bride with, I believe, her naval officer husband, and they're cutting the cake with his sword. And here's the cardboard cake cover. That's all decorated to look like white frosting, right? But it's an unfrosted fruit cake. So that's their ration-friendly wedding cake. Post-war, all of our rationing is over. We have like the return of everything fatty and sugary and delicious. And we've by now kind of entrenched some of our wedding traditions, right? You maybe recognize this is Elizabeth Taylor, and I forget which husband this is. I should have written it down. We also have the rise of Hollywood, right? Like that starts in the 1920s, gets real glamorous in the 30s and 40s, and by the 50s, Hollywood actors and actresses are full-blown national celebrities. And then this was an interesting statistic I found. The median age to marry declined to the lowest rate ever between 1950 and 1980, right? So people are getting married younger than ever. That is almost certainly a reaction to the economic boom. Post-war, rising wages, it's easier to buy a house, right? It's easier to support a family on a single wage. Those things historically were obstacles. For instance, people in the early 19th century most men did not get married until their 30s in the early 19th century, unless they, you know, their father had passed away or whatever, because they had to be able to support a wife, and men were not considered adults really until their mid-20s. People in general were not considered adults until their mid-20s. That changes in the 20th century. You graduate high school, you can go get a job, support a family. So people are getting married straight out of high school, right? And then another influence on wedding food in particular is the popularity of international cuisines. Post-war, GIs who were in Europe and the Pacific return with an interest in those cuisines, and that starts to influence wedding food as well. 1965 to 1980, we have some cultural changes that are influencing weddings. We have second wave feminism, right? So less and less, you know, vow to obey your husband, right? The rise of natural food and hippies. There's this great photo of a hippie wedding, right? It's taking place outside. Everybody's just wearing cotton dresses. I think this is the bride and groom, although one of the bridesmaids is wearing a white dress and she kind of looks like a bride, but this bouquet is much larger. Everybody's got flower crowns on. Super cute. This could probably be a wedding, you know, a hipster wedding today, but that is kind of coming back. You have a number of very famous celebrity weddings in the 60s and 70s, including Elvis Presley in 67 and Patricia Nixon, President Richard Nixon's daughter, getting married in 1971. In the 1980s to the 2000s, weddings become kind of even more standardized than they had been previously, and there's a renewed emphasis on individuality and the individuality of the bride and groom. So most weddings are held in reception halls and hotel ballrooms, right? Almost nobody is getting married in the home. It gets more and more expensive to have these receptions, right? There's this idea that this is just how much a wedding costs, and these are the things that you do, and this is just the way it is, and that's how much you have to pay, right? You might, if you're interested in weddings, you might hear it referred to as the wedding industrial complex, right? This idea that you have to buy into all these very specific, very traditional things, which, as you'll see as we're going through, are not necessarily that traditional at all. Cakes get increasingly elaborate. Maybe if you look through some of the pictures, I had a couple of cake pictures, you know, they're like one, maybe two tiers, right? This one is a crazy, how many, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different cakes connected by staircases, and I don't even know where the bride and groom are, but there's the fountain underneath it, all this crazy stuff. And then, of course, in the 1990s, we have Martha Stewart, who starts to have a huge influence on the wedding industry in the 90s and 2000s. And then the one really big change, I think, is that dancing really becomes standard at most wedding receptions. Wedding receptions without dancing become the exception rather than the rule as they had been for most of American history. And then the 2000s to today, right, we're focused on the uniqueness of the couple. There's like this rustic aesthetic that's still happening even as we enter, we're into the 2020s now. The recession in the 2000s, I think the pandemic and our burgeoning stagflation that's happening. People are having smaller weddings. They're experimenting with home weddings and elopements. People who aren't going the smaller wedding route are getting wedding loans. Banks are offering wedding loans, personal loans to pay for your wedding. And so that kind of brings us to the general trends of weddings throughout the decades. And I want to talk about some specifics. So we have the ceremony, right? Again, there's at home, there's in churches. Out of doors ceremonies begin in the 1910s. There's a big movement in the progressive era toward, the natural environment and being out of doors. Hiking, camping, the arts and crafts movement kind of gets started at that point. So that becomes more of a trend in the 20th century. Professional venues hosting wedding receptions starts in the 1860s when we start to get professional catering. And so let's talk about some of the food-related trends with ceremonies, right? So we have orange blossoms, which really are a symbol of fertility because they bloom and fruit at the same time. So it's like the young virginal bride who will probably be pregnant within a year, right, is represented by orange blossoms, popularized by Queen Victoria. And this song sheet cover that I found from the 19-teens, when it's orange blossom time in Loveland, I'll be waiting at the church for you, right? And it's got this cute little bride with her little very late 19-teens, 1920s veil with a crown of orange blossoms and a bouquet of orange blossoms, and there's orange blossoms all around. The other one is rice. You saw we had a couple images of rice throwing. That dates back all the way to Roman times. Again, grain symbolizing fertility. It gets kind of readopted as a tradition in the late 19th century, probably in large part because commercial rice production makes it much more available and affordable. Rice was not particularly ubiquitous in the United States unless you're in the Carolinas in the early part of the 19th century. So that starts later. And again, it's kind of this nostalgia that's coming around at the turn of the 20th century about old-fashioned things that are getting forgotten. Rice might be part of that too. So the reception, let's talk about the actual reception food, right? So about 1850 to 1880, we have the wedding breakfast. This etiquette manual from 1860 says wine and cake are sufficient to hand to each guest at a morning reception, right? So that kind of translates to the cake and punch wedding reception that continues until the 20th century. Breakfasts, again, are in the home. There are sit-down breakfasts, really a luncheon, which we'll get to in a minute, for immediate family. And they start to become more and more elaborate after the American Civil War. So this is an image from about 1840s-ish, judging by the clothing. It's called the wedding feast. So here's the very shy-looking bride and groom in the middle, and they're being toasted, right, with wine. And there's this kind of elaborate table, but it's not very big. So these are probably all immediate family members, right? So there's, looks like a grandfather here and a grandfather and a grandmother here and some cousins, maybe some younger siblings. This bench has been pushed back and stuff has kind of been knocked over, right? This is toward the end of the wedding feast. But you can tell it's in their house. It's in their dining room. There's no special decorations, really, other than I think this is a pineapple on the table and whatever fancy dishes they wanted to pull out. Everybody's wearing their best clothes. She is wearing white, which makes me think it's probably after Queen Victoria got married, so maybe later in the 1840s. But this is very typical of the time period. They're slightly more affluent family, judging by the interior of their home, but not a huge wedding reception that we would have come to associate with affluence later in the century. I did also want to get a quote in from Little Women. So of course, Little Women, the belief system of the March family is transcendentalism, right? So it's relatively austere. So it says, there was no display of gifts, for they were already in the little house, nor was there an elaborate breakfast, but a plentiful lunch of cake and fruit dressed with flowers. Mr. Lawrence and Aunt March shrugged and smiled at one another when water, lemonade, and coffee were found to be the only sorts of nectar which the three Hebes carried around. Right, so this is for Meg's wedding. The March family were probably also this reference to water, lemonade, and coffee, only no wine, right? Because the March family were temperance advocates, so no wine at their reception, but cake and fruit. And some rather more austere beverages, right? So again, very simple in the home, very practical wedding presents, right? They're designed to outfit Meg. Oh gosh, I'm forgetting his name now. Mr. Burke, is that his name? Anyway, to outfit them to actually live in their little house. So that's kind of the more simple version of weddings. This is another one in the home from about the 1860s. You can see they're very wealthy, judging by the furnishings, and there are some flower decorations. Right here's the bride with her oh gosh, no, or is this the bride? I think this is the bride with her orange blossoms. Maybe I don't know what she's doing. Here's a rather more elaborate cake in the middle. But again, they're all crowded into the dining room. It looks to be exclusively family. And although they are very wealthy, it's not a very big reception. In the latter part of the 19th into the 20th century, we still have wedding breakfasts until the 1930s. That is still what they are called. There's two options. You can have a seated breakfast, which is like, plated meals. There's removes, whatever. Very French influence generally. Or you can have a standing breakfast, which is basically a buffet. So Emily Post makes the important distinction that whatever there is must be selected with a view to its being easily eaten with a fork, while the plate is held in the other hand. So don't serve anything that would require both a knife and a fork, right? That's Emily Post for you. And then you would sometimes also, with morning weddings, you could have a luncheon, right? Instead of having it prior to the noon hour, you could have it after the noon hour. That did happen sometimes. And then if you had an afternoon wedding, you could have a tea, which would be like, 3, 4 o'clock time period. So this is a little biscuit advertisement. You can see it's a little cabinet card, but again, very wealthy family. And this is their wedding breakfast. They're having just immediate family. Here's the bride. Looks like she's cutting the cake. There's all kinds of other desserts, fruit on the table. And so one of the footman probably is like, hey, let's bring out the biscuits for dessert. So we do start to get evening receptions in the late 19th century. They are not the norm, but they do start to happen, particularly among the upper class. So from this 1860 etiquette book, it says, let the supper be laid early and ready when the ceremony is over, but the guests may pass into the dining room if they wish, as soon as they have spoken to the bride. So this is a dinner, but the wedding is still happening in the home, and the ceremony is supposed to be held somewhere else other than the dining room. So everybody could just walk into the dining room when the ceremony is over. Like I said, it's much more common in wealthier households, which, in some wealthy households, you might not even be up before noon, depending on what your party schedule looks like. So they were more common to be held afternoon ceremonies with an evening reception. And dancing happened, but was not usual until really the end of the 19th century. And it's not the norm until after the 1950s in a lot of instances. This is an 1880s wedding breakfast. This is a room, possibly in a home, but maybe in a hotel, probably more than one of these tables arrayed. You can see it's a huge dining table. They've got, these are probably ices, right? They've got this huge wedding cake. There's champagne, there's pineapples and fruit and all sorts of goodies everywhere. Flower decorations everywhere. This might have been in a hotel. It could have been in a private room. It doesn't really say. It's just called a wedding breakfast table. But you can see how elaborate we're getting in the latter part of the century. And then the menus. So this example of a menu is from the British Cordon Bleu. It's extremely elaborate with French influence, right? Like most of it is in French. Pretty much all of it is in French. And it's from Jessup Whitehead, right? The Stewart's Handbook and Guide to Party Catering. Jessup Whitehead was a very influential late 19th century caterer and cookbook author. So this we'll just go over. So it's like black caviar. There's two different types of caviar. We have oysters, pâté de foie gras, galantine de tête de veau, which is a veal's head galantine. It's like a jellied thing. There's terrines, salmon with mayonnaise, right? We've got, what else do we have? Beef tongue, right? Cold beef tongue, roast beef, Yorkshire ham, all kinds of pâtés, roasted pheasant, pheasant à l'indienne, which maybe was curried, more like aspics, more pâté. It's almost all meat, right? And then we have salads at the end. And then you have pâtissier, you know, all different kinds of patisseries, meringues, nougats, cakes, creams, jellies, ices, which is like either ice cream or lemon ice, you know, without cream or milk, and then a bunch of liquor, right? So this is very elaborate by today's standard, but not necessarily by Gilded Age standards. This is a little bit more reasonable wedding breakfast from an actual wedding by a St. Louis couple. The family was very wealthy. And this is for 150 covers. And covers is a restaurant term meaning basically place settings. So this was for 150 people at this reception. So you're not fitting those people in your home. Maybe if you're the Vanderbilts or the Rockefellers, you could, but that's a lot of people, right? So they have consommé in cups. This is like oyster pate. I don't know what that is, but whatever. They're having oysters that are also pate. Tomatoes, cucumbers. I don't know what pompano is. Duchess potatoes. And there's a wine. Tenderloin of beef with truffles, French peas. Maryland terrapin, which is a type of sea turtle, with sherry. Roman punch is a very alcoholic punch. Bride's cake, snipe, asparagus, again, another wine. Charlotte russe cakes, Veuve Clicquot, right? That's champagne. And then finish with cheese, ice cream, fruits, coffee, and Apollinaris water as sparkling mineral water. So that's still a lot, even by today's standards, right? And again, this is from Jessup Whitehead. So here he's describing an actual wedding that he did. And then if, you know, 1889, if you wanted a very simple wedding breakfast with a restricted price of $2 per person, which is still kind of a lot in 1889, you could have consommé, aspic of prawns, lobster salad, roast balls, Cumberland ham, roast beef, roast lamb, pressed beef, Swiss cake, fruit jelly, strawberry cream, and lemon water ices, dessert, and bonbons. So you're still having two options for the fish course, a soup course, and then 4 meat options, right? Which people are probably gonna eat everything. And then dessert. No vegetables, but that's the simple restricted version. This is an example, again, of a seated breakfast. This is from 1905. Hard to tell if this is in like a hotel or somebody's house because of all the million potted palms, but this is a thing in the 1900s, 1910s, to have just greenery everywhere. And people are pretty dressed up. So this is probably a pretty wealthy family. Here's the bride with her beautiful veil and the groom, and they're all being toasted. Everybody's standing for a toast. So we can't really see what's at the table. But just an example of a, still in 1905, we're having small family only wedding breakfasts. This is from 1910. So this is a much more middle class, working class wedding breakfast, right? Everybody's crammed in the dining room. This might not be a dining room table. We don't know. It's hard to tell from the image. It could have, boards set on top to make it longer. Or this could have been their regular dining room table. But here's everybody kind of jammed around. And there's still quite an elaborate wedding cake, right, with fruit. But, people just have small plates with napkins. So this is probably a cake and punch or a cake and lemonade reception, not a meal. By the time we get into the 20th century, we're getting much simpler, even for the wealthy, in our wedding breakfasts. This is an example from a 1919 cookbook for seated breakfast food. So again, this is not a catering cookbook. So this is for people who are probably doing their own wedding planning. But you can see there's examples of like floral decorations, right? Sweet white peas and maidenhair ferns. The menu is strawberries au naturel, so with nothing, just plain strawberries. Halibut with cucumbers, peas and white sauce rolls. That's your fish course. Baked fillet of chicken breast with mushroom sauce, lettuce and asparagus tip salad with iced mayonnaise. Right, that's your main course and your salad probably. Fruit ices in spun sugar nests. Super fancy. Assorted cakes, bonbons, coffee. The end. I love that that's on there. So there's way less meat on this, right? More vegetables, more salads, more fruit. And this is from Janet Mackenzie Hill. He's a great early 20th century cookbook author. So this is from Emily Post, right? For seated breakfast. So she has bouillon, lobster Newburgh, supreme of chicken with peas, aspic of foie gras, celery salad, ices, coffee. And then she gives options. Instead of bouillon, there may be caviar or melon or grapefruit or puree or clam broth. Some kind of like appetizer-y starter. For lobster Newburgh, maybe soft shell crabs or oyster pate or other fish. Or the bouillon may be followed by a dish such as sweetbreads and mushrooms or chicken pate or broiled chicken or squab with salads such as whole tomatoes filled with celery. Or the chicken or squab may be the second course, and aspic with the salad the third. Individual ices are accompanied by little cakes of assorted variety, right? So even though that's still pretty fancy by today's standards, it is miles away from the crazy menus of Jessup Whitehead, right? She also gives suggestions for a standing breakfast, right? Everything cold, right? Aspic of chicken, ham mousse, terrines, cold cuts, sandwiches even. And then hot dishes, boned capon, right? You got to be able to eat it with a fork. The vol au vent of sweetbread and mushroom. The vol au vent is like a little pastry case. Sweetbreads, I don't know if I described this before. Sweetbreads are the thymus gland of calves. They're usually fried, sometimes creamed, and they were considered an aphrodisiac. So you see them often in wedding menus. And then again, everything is, this is the 1920s, so we're going to put everything in cream. Creamed oysters, chicken a la king, that's got like a cream sauce, chicken croquettes, right, little fried chopped chicken and cream. And then ices or ice cream, which you probably would have eaten with a fork in the 1920s because it was sliced, right? You eat it on a plate with a fork. Anyway. So post 1920s, they start to get some changes to our receptions, right? We have catering as early as the 1860s that really starts to take off in the late 19th and early 20th century. Ordinary people can start to afford it in the 1920s. They become more elaborate. Venues like hotels start to have ballrooms, not to hold public balls, but for wedding receptions and other big public events. And again, we're going to turn to Emily Post. She says, those whose houses are very small and yet who wish to have a general reception sometimes give the wedding breakfast in a hotel or assembly rooms. The preparations are identical with those in a private house. The decorations and menu may be lavish or simple. Although it is perfectly good form to hold a wedding reception in a ballroom, a breakfast in a private house, no matter how simple, has greater distinction than the most elaborate collation in a public establishment. Why this is so is hard to determine. It is probably that without a home atmosphere, though it may be a brilliant entertainment, the sentiment is missing. So that's Emily Post in 1922. And I just found that so interesting because the 20s are really the kind of the turning point between kind of the bigger public receptions and the small home receptions. We do still continue to have small home receptions really until the 1950s and 60s. But the tide is turning in the 1920s, and she I think has her finger on the pulse of American culture at that time. So she also, maybe we don't have to do too much with this, but she's giving advice for caterers and how people can accommodate caterers in their houses, right? So she's talking about bain-maries for hot food and ice for ice cream and cold foods. This is an example of reception from about 1940. Again, it's a home reception. Everybody's crowded in here. I love the people standing on chairs in the back so they can actually be seen by the photographer. We have these super tall candles, which were a thing in the 40s. And there's just coffee and cake. And that is apparently all the reception is. So not super elaborate. This is from the American Women's Home Cookbook, this version was published in 1941. It's got a variety of wedding menus. Again, pretty pared down from Jessup Whitehead, but still a lot of standards. There's chicken a la king on there, right? There's cream sweetbreads. We're having bouillon and cream lobster and chicken salad, right? And then there's this other interesting thing that's happening, which we have the bride's cake and the groom's cake on just about every menu. So we'll be talking about that. What's the difference and why there are two? This one is from 1943. So this is more of a meal reception. I love this image. It's I believe it's from the Library of Congress. And it says, okay, so he's getting married because he's exempted from the draft because he does important wartime work for the government. Right, so he's not slacking off. He's not a draft dodger. He does important wartime work for the government. So that's why he's able to get married. But we can see this very elaborate, but not super huge 3-tiered cake. I don't know if this is real sugar or not. It's hard to tell. It might be. And then the bride and groom figurine on top. And of course, ferns, right? Ferns are still in style. This is another one. I don't think it's from the same wedding, hard to tell though, but it's very clearly in a local hall, right? I mean, it even looks like it might be like a school auditorium almost, right? But there are all these little folding chairs, right? And the bride and groom are here at the head table, and then there's side tables. So it's a little bit bigger. It's in a public space. Again, 1943, New American Cookbook, wedding breakfast, fruit, grilled sweetbreads, French fries, rolls, jelly, ice cream, wedding cake. Aside from the grilled sweetbreads, French fries at a wedding sounds good to me, right? The Settlement Cookbook has a whole bunch of wedding menus, some of them harkening back to the 19th century, right? Some of them more simple than others. But they also have bride's cake and groom's cake and mock champagne punch, right? And the bride's cake says white cake and the groom's cake says wedding cake. What's that about? We'll get there. This is actually a luncheon. This is Fanny Farber in 1948. The wedding breakfast, which she says is actually a luncheon, right? It's not traditional breakfast like we think of it today. So hers is super simple, just a broth, a consomme, cream lobster in cases with rolls, strawberry parfait, a Moor, and black coffee. She doesn't have a wedding cake on her list. This is and Nancy Reagan, who eloped and then went back to a friend's house for this giant wedding cake. I think they just had a cake and punch reception, but they did not have a big wedding, so it was just them and their friends. So I thought that was sweet. Oh, I clicked off here. This one is from 1953. This is one of the few images I could find of an African-American wedding from this time period. It's being held in like a dance hall or a ballroom or a club. You know, you can see it's very elaborate. Here's the head table with all these garlands, this giant wedding cake. There's champagne fountains, and then big buffets with all these giant stacks of plates. So this is a little bit closer to what we think of as a wedding reception today, but I love this because it's got the stage here with the guys like with maracas and tropical stuff in the background. So just kind of a fun alternative. And of course these they still make these little like accordion unfolding wedding bells. That's fun. You probably recognize these people, right? Jackie and John Kennedy having an outdoor reception, right, on the family estate with a relatively, but not super crazy wedding cake there. And then I don't know if you can see, but these are halves of pineapple filled with some kind of salad. So pretty elaborate, right? Oh yeah, here's a better view of the pineapple. So this, instead of having consomme or whatever, that's their starter, is a half a pineapple with some kind of salad in it. All right, so let's talk about the cakes. I gotta have Laura Ingalls Wilder in here too, right? So that afternoon, the finished black cashmere dress, for those who don't remember Laura Ingalls Wilder, she had a black dress made for her wedding because she wanted it to be practical, was carefully pressed, and then Mom made a big white cake. Laura helped her by beating the egg whites on a platter with a fork until Ma said they were stiff enough. My arm is stiffer, Laura ruefully laughed, rubbing her aching arm. This cake must be just right, Ma insisted. If you can't have a wedding party, at least you shall have a wedding dinner at home and a wedding cake. So Laura didn't want to have a giant wedding because she didn't want Pa to have to pay for it, right? Because they were not very wealthy. And Almanza Wilder wanted to get married kind of in a hurry before his mom and sister came out and took over the planning of their wedding reception. So they just had a little at-home reception. They got married in the minister's house and had a little wedding dinner at home with just them. So the original wedding cake was a fruit cake. And this dates back to medieval period with the medieval great cakes, right? They're flavored with honey or later with sugar as it became more available, with spices, with imported nuts like almonds, with imported fruits, dried fruits, right? And that was the height of wealth and sophistication in the medieval and early modern period. By the time we get to the 19th century, most of those things are relatively affordable for most people, but the tradition stays on. They're basically fruit cakes. They would be made in advance. The white frosting helped hold the moisture in, so they stayed moist. So that persists, as we'll see, until the 20th century. But then bridal cake comes onto the scene in the mid 19th century. It starts to get really popular. Those cakes were leavened with eggs, like a genoise or a sponge cake like Laura did, beating those egg whites by hand. But then we start to get chemical leaveners, like baking soda and baking powder, you know, cream of tartar, things like that. And white flour, sugar, refined white sugar, both of those get much more available and much more affordable in the mid 19th century, thanks in large part to agricultural mechanization and also slavery. So those things are easier to get, and those chemical leaveners make fine white cakes like that a lot easier to bake. So the fruit cake becomes the groom's cake. and it becomes a souvenir, right? Because fruitcake keeps forever, especially if you're either frosting it or dousing it with alcohol, as we do for Christmas fruitcake. So the white cake was more delicate, more perishable. It was meant to be eaten at the reception, and people would get a slice of cake in a little box as a souvenir of the wedding. And that's a tradition, again, that starts with Queen Victoria. This is a slice of fruitcake from her wedding that lives in a museum now. Giving food souvenirs to commemorate events, public events, was not uncommon in the 18th and early 19th century. For instance, people would give away cookies at funerals. So that was another tradition. Again, bridal cake was eaten, groom's cake was taken home. This is souvenir cake from the wedding of Charles Stratton and Lavinia Warren, aka General Tom Thumb. Their wedding was hosted by P.T. Barnum. They were both little people. They sold tickets, and this was the fruitcake that was given as a souvenir from that wedding. Again, saved by somebody, never eaten, ends up in a museum. Princess Louise gets married in 1871 in England. This is her cake. This ridiculous monstrosity is her cake. Where the actual cake is in here, it says the lower cake, right, is 2 feet in diameter, and the whole thing is almost 5 feet tall, but probably a lot of it is, you know, decoration and not actual cake. It doesn't even say what type of cake it is, which is just very Gilded Age, you know. I guess 1870s is like borderline Gilded Age, but this is what people were interested in, was the decorations more than the flavors. This is Woodrow Wilson's daughter's wedding cake. She got married while he was president. This is her cake. 1913, very modest, 2-tier white frosted cake with a giant vase of flowers on top, greenery everywhere, very typical of the period. So the souvenir cake sticks around. Again, we have Emily Post. She says, in addition to the big cake on the bride's table, there are at all weddings near the front door, so that the guests may each take one as they go home, little individual boxes of wedding cake, black fruitcake. Each box is made of white moiré or grosgrain paper embossed in silver with the last initial of the groom intertwined with that of the bride and tied with white satin ribbon. At a sit-down breakfast, the wedding cake boxes are sometimes put one at each place on the table so that the guests may be sure of receiving one, and other thoughtless ones prevented from carrying more than their fair share away, right? So you'd put one at each place to make sure that people didn't take a whole bunch when they left, which still happens at some weddings today. So I love this. This is the American Women's Cookbook, again, 1941. And I picked this image because there's a Christmas fruitcake and a wedding cake, and there's not a whole lot of difference between the recipes, right? So this one calls for raisins and currants and citron and dates and molasses, right, and almonds. This one calls for raisins and currants and citron and almonds and spices, right? So very, very similar style of cake. Again, we talked about World War II and the elaborate faux wedding cake toppers. This one, it's hard to say if it was a faux. It's a war bride, like Libyan captain, right, getting married. But this all looks like spun sugar, which during World War II was rations. So I don't know if people saved up their rations or if this is actually like, you know, piped plaster of Paris. We don't know for sure. And then here's just a very little simple one, which looks like it has real frosting. Again, this is from the 1940s. This is the bride and groom. Bride's wearing a suit. That starts to be a thing in the 40s. And it looks like they just have sandwiches for their reception, nothing fancy. Again, it's in their home. Again, we have the fruitcake style wedding cake in 1946. Into the 50s, we've got fruitcake style wedding cake. So we're starting to get the taller tiers, right? So this is probably a layer cake. with the bells on top. I love her tiara and veil. It's so cute. Again, 62. This is like either in a church basement or like a school gymnasium. It looks like to me. We still have these super tall candles, but she's got a little pillbox hat on, right, with her little boat neck style wedding dresses from the 60s. And we start to get columns on our wedding cakes. 67, again, with the giant wedding bells, columns, they're feeding each other cake. Again, with the tiara, it's so cute. This is Elvis and Priscilla Presley with their giant 7, is it 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, sorry, 6 tier, unless there's one down at the bottom that I'm missing. 6 tier wedding cake, again, with the columns holding up each layer to make it look even bigger. Priscilla looking very 60s in her wedding dress there. I love this image because this is just like very typical of the warring factions in weddings, one of which is like do what the bride and groom want, and one of which is do what the mother of the bride or the mother-in-law wants. So here's this cute little hippie couple, and they've got this very traditional wedding cake with the tuxedo and white bridal dress, bride and groom cake topper. So just a hilarious juxtaposition, but again, it's in the home. This one's from the 70s. I love her super short wedding dress, but very traditional. There's even little white sugar swans on this one with, again, with the pillars. Everything's still white, though, white and piped frosting and spun sugar. This is Patricia Nixon's cake. This one is also 6 tier, maybe 7 tier. Quite large tiers as well. This is in the White House. So technically she's having her reception at home. And again, the 80s, look at this cute little couple. Very similar style with the tiers on pillars. 89, we start to get some color, right? There's purple roses on this one and a blood red fountain underneath. I don't know who was thinking of that one. It looks a little scary, but these people also look to be about 17. But very sweet. The 1990s, right? You can see the Martha Stewart influence on this one. This one may be a Martha Stewart weddings cake. We are moving away from buttercream and toward fondant. And these are all spun sugar flowers. The 2000s are my least favorite time period for cakes, including, I'm sure, the least favorite time period for most bakers, because these topsy-turvy cakes were in fashion, where they're like uneven, covered in fondant, very colorful, you know, lime green and red with black polka dots. There's stars everywhere. There's starfish, kind of a beachy thing going on. So much more representative of the individuality of the bride and groom. The 2010s, we have naked cakes become a thing, which is a cake without exterior frosting, usually just a filling. And then also in the 2000s, we get, you know, like cupcakes and donuts and pies and cheesecakes that are actually just giant wheels of cheese. That starts to happen too. So the individuality of the bride and groom becomes more important than the tradition behind the wedding, which, as we saw, traditions change over time. And in the early 20th century, late, 1990s, early 2000s, we have the return of the groom's cake, which I chose this image because it's literally like, this is a bridal dress, this is a tux. The groom's cake is usually chocolate, right? A lot of bridal cake is white or almond or lemon, right? The groom's cake is usually chocolate. You don't see it super often anymore, I think in large part because people are just being less traditional with their cake choices. For instance, I had 3 sheet cakes of all different flavors at my wedding, in addition to my wedding cake. But it's just an interesting thing to see that groom's cake return, not as a souvenir, but just as like an alternative to the bride's cakes. You also do see groom cakes that are more representative of the groom's interests. So it might be, like themed with his favorite sports team, or if he's really into fishing, it might have fish on it, stuff like that. Because a lot of modern weddings are very focused on the bride and not so much on the groom. But I think that's changing as we get a little more egalitarian, and also as we start to have more and more same-sex and gender non-binary weddings, right? So what's the future of weddings? Who knows? The pandemic told us you can have Zoom weddings, right? I don't know how you have send people cake, wedding cake in a Zoom wedding, but maybe we need to bring back the souvenir cake. And you can send it to people who couldn't be there. But that's my presentation. I hope everyone enjoyed it. I see we have a couple questions or comments here. Let me just scroll through them. Oh, someone's saying Nikki Hilton, is that Elizabeth Taylor's first husband? Thank you. Donna, thank you. Pompano is a fish. That makes sense. Yes. Mom won with the cake, if not the wedding, for our cute hippie couple. Ooh, Belinda, any theory as to why brides are not wearing veils anymore in the ceremony? I saw a picture on Facebook that I swore was a prom picture until I read that it was a wedding. Yeah, veils. I didn't get into a lot of the other wedding traditions that were not food related, but veils historically have been to signal modesty and purity. You know, veiled women are, you know, not married, they have to cover their face. So there's a lot of sort of like patriarchal stuff around veils, which is why I think people are not doing them as often. You do still see them. A couple of my friends who got married had veils, but they had more traditional weddings than I did. I did not. I wore like a stretchy wedding dress and had my hair down, you know, so I think it's more to the preference of the bride as to what she wants to wear on her day. I saw a thing that just yesterday or the other day before, I think it was in the New York Times or something, about black wedding dresses are becoming more and more of a trend. Color wedding dresses too, but like just recently black wedding dresses were a thing. Emulating Laura Ingalls Wilder, I guess, and not listening to Ma's advice of married in black, you'll wish yourself back, right? That's an old wedding related rhyme. Yes, Donna, don't party favors sort of take the place of souvenir cakes? They do. They do. But more and more people's favors are food, you know, like Jordan almonds are the traditional thing, but my wedding favor was a trail mix bar because people had traveled from kind of far away. Yes, Mariette, definitely the Food Network has influenced cake. Yeah, like Ace of Cakes and all those. Now there's the Is It Cake? Cakes that look like things that are not cake. I don't know if anybody's doing that for their wedding cake, but certainly that is still a thing. Do they still have sweet tables? I don't know what that means. So like a candy table or like an assortment of desserts? Certainly historically, they had an assortment and not necessarily just one cake. Ooh, Alicia says there were a lot of pineapples in the photos. Were other status fruits served, or was it more local seasonal? So definitely strawberries play a huge role, I think, because of the time of year. A lot of people are getting married in the early summer. But pineapples certainly are, you know, colonial era symbols of wealth and hospitality. So I think that's why they show up on a lot of tables. But also, you know, like with the Kennedys, Polynesian food was big in the 50s and 60s, so that may have played a role as well. Belinda says, I saw that article in black wedding dresses as well. Sarah Jessica Parker later regretted her black wedding dress. And she says, I prefer anything over Jordan almonds. The problem with Jordan almonds is a lot of them are usually very stale, right, and hard. If you can get fresh ones, they're not so bad, but yeah, they're not the favorite of everybody. All right, well, I will stop sharing so I can see people's faces. Does anybody else have any other questions for me?
Well, I saw in the chat that this was a fun program, and I think everybody did. We really did enjoy this, Sarah. I really want to thank you very much.
Great.
You covered the basics besides the food, just how things evolved, and then kind of would go back to the same, and then kind of go forward again. And what's old is new, and new is old. Always.
Right. Maybe the future trend will be orange blossoms. Right. Who knows?
That was definitely interesting. You know, I was like, I bet you they're very, I mean, you don't think of it, but I'm like, I bet you it's very pretty. I did have
And
real
fragrant.
flowers on my wedding cake. I had like a little thing of that, but it was, again, the 90s, so who knows?
My wedding cake was made by a friend of the family as a gift for us. And I asked for yellow cake with my mother-in-law makes this really delicious cooked like nut cream flour filling. So I asked for that with pecans and then homemade buttercream, and it was the best cake I'd ever had. It was so good. And then I, being an overachiever, made 2 additional sheet cakes. I made a homemade carrot cake with a naked cake, right? So I only put the cream cheese frosting on the top and in the middle. And then I made a chocolate cake with sour cherry jam and whipped cream, which actually was not like, it didn't turn out as good as the other ones, but it was so good.
And then this one is for me. This is being recorded. I am going to put this up on the Upper Saddle River Library YouTube page. I'll send a link to anybody that registered through the library. I will send a link of that. And then the last one, that's for you, your book, 8 Flavors.
So that's the other Sarah food historian. That's Sarah Lohman, not me. No, my book that I haven't published yet is on food in World War I. But Sarah Lohman is another great food historian. She has a book called 8 Flavors, which is about kind of 8 quintessential American flavors that she looks at the history of. And she also does food talks. So I think her website is sarahlohman.com if you want to check her out, Lohman. But we do get confused sometimes. 2 Sarahs doing food history, but we're not the same person. So.
And then yours is at thefoodhistorian.com. So that's
thefoodhistorian.com.
If anybody wants to check that out. Well, again, thank you. And thanks everybody for coming. And like I said, I will send the link to this program as a follow-up, but it probably will take about a day or 2 for it to get up there. So thanks everyone. Right. And I hope you enjoy your evening. And now we can all, it's about that time. I guess we should all have a slice of cake.
Thanks everybody.
Take care.
Good night.